Can you hear me? Oh, yeah, you can.
Yes.
We're gonna start at like 11:03.
You mean 11:04?
I mean, I meant 11:03, but do you want to start at 11:04?
Well, it's
11:03
and 43 seconds.
Oh, okay, our timer is wrong then, which is not great.
So it's going to be 11:04. Hold on one second. So right now it's 11:04. So start in 1 minute.
Yeah, but I think ours is different because we're on 11:01 and 28 seconds right now.
All right, so
Yeah.
then 11:02 at your time.
11:02? Okay.
Yeah. Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Think with a Drink. This is the weekly webinar series brought to you by the Aries Foundation for Financial Education. In this week's show, Craig, we got a fun one. So this is the sandwich generation getting squeezed, or what Craig and I affectionately like to call the Pennini generation, because that's what's happening. And we're going to go through all the iterations of this and, you know, what the sandwich generation was or is currently and why it is such a squeeze going on right now. Next slide, please. So real quickly, just an introduction to who we are. Tom Alessi, I am the president of the Aries Foundation for Financial Education. I have been in financial services for 25 years. I am an investment advisor. If I had the little things after my name, it would tell you that I was a certified fiduciary, which just means that I'm acting in whoever I am sitting down with's best interest whenever I'm giving any guidance or advice. I'd like to bring my vice president on. Craig, if you can introduce yourself.
Sure. So I'm Craig Richardson. I'm the vice president of the Aries Foundation. I've been in financial services a little over 20 years now, and I specialize in working with families, individuals, to help them define their financial goals and have a better relationship with their money.
So next slide, just real quick on the Aries Foundation. We're a nonprofit. We're located in Newton. You can find us on the web. It's www.ariesfoundation.org. The mission behind Aries is trying to help everyone have a better relationship with their money. Because whether you realize it or not, you're in a relationship with your money. And just like every other personal relationship that you have, there are behaviors, triggers, things that cause us to act, well, a little irrationally sometimes when it comes to dealing with our money and our finances. That's all myself, Craig, the rest of the Aries team tries to do is to take some of that emotion out of dealing with your money. So what way that we try to do that, next slide please, that we try to do is, you know, the concept behind this is we take a lot of, let's call it daunting, overwhelming, these financial topics, try to break them down, make them a little simpler, make them a little easier. And honestly, we can't think of a better way to do that than if we're sitting here relaxing and having something to drink. It's called Experimental DIPA.
Ooh.
This is a double IPA. This is from our friends at Black Hat Brew Works. Try saying that one quickly. That's a tough one. They're down, I think they're in Bridgewater too. Black Hat Brew Works, Bridgewater, you know, in terms of going through that. But a double IPA for everybody out there in the audience just means that they've added more to everything.
Wow.
More hops, more malts, And what happens there is with the malts, that just creates more for the yeast to grab onto, which raises up the alcohol content.
I would say more alcohol, yes.
More alcohol is eventually what you get with this, but surprisingly, and probably why they have this labeled as experimental DIPA, is that it actually is quite refreshing, and you don't really get that overwhelming hop. You know, a lot of times if you take some of these and they're very, very hoppy, you don't get that. So it is actually quite refreshing. But anyway, Skol.
Oh.
All right, on to all right. So a brief history of the sandwich generation for everyone, right? So, and I think, you know, this is something, the term's been around for a while now and going through it. And certainly prior to the pandemic, what you were seeing was a lot of families, probably about 50% of those in their 40s, you know, call it late 50s, were juggling sort of both sides of things. I'm raising children, but now my parents have to be part of this equation.
Right, right.
And so what was happening there is there was this more of this burden coming on to families trying to figure out where are we directing things, how are we directing it, and what that meant for their resources, right, for trying to deal with all of that stuff.
Right, just like the Waltons.
I don't know that it was just like the
Waltons.
Waltons. Like, who's going to know the Waltons on this program? In terms
Anybody
of
watching us on public access will know the Waltons.
The Waltons, all I can think about is the Celtics and Bill Walton. There you go.
Okay.
See there.
Well, that's a different Walton.
Yes, that's a different one. So, next slide, please. Let's move on. All right. So here's the reality, and I think this is more, Craig, coming out of the pandemic than it is anything else, is what you are starting to see is more and more of this family dynamic where that they are providing care. And again, we're talking about families, people who are in their, say, late 30s to mid 50s, who are actually in the situation of providing care for their parents. And as you can see on the screen, it's saying that basically about 21% of the population is doing that. At the same time, 50% of those families are saying that they are providing care for their adult children. Not children anymore, adult children, which I think we're running into more. Like you and I are seeing that on a more regular basis.
Yes, we are, yeah. People are they're not launching as early as they used to.
Launching. That's a good word for it, not launching.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
But I think that's what's happening is that you're seeing this, and I think some of it is, well, we want to take care of mom and dad, right? However that comes about, whatever that looks like, whether that's care, need, time, or money.
Yeah, I mean, even since, you know, we were born back when, I won't get into that number, but, you know, the life expectancy has increased about 10 years since we were born.
Right.
Right, so the beauty of that is people are living longer. The difficulty with that is people are living longer, right? And they need those care. And so people who are now starting their families in their, you know, early 30s, you know, they're having teenagers at the same time they're dealing with parents who are retired and starting to need some of those services like you said.
Right.
And so you either get squeezed, like you said, either on a care note, which is a time consumption, or a financial note, which puts more pressure on you from that perspective.
Which is really, and that's the next slide where this comes in, this whole idea of the next slide, please. Where this whole idea and the concept of the Pennini generation comes in. Right, so this is the sandwich generation that we've heard about and talked about probably for the last 20 plus years now. Right. This has been terminology that's been around, but for Craig and I, like we said, we talk about this as as getting squeezed, which, as my Italian heritage, is a panini.
Yes.
Which is what we get from this, right? So this idea that both sides now, and as Craig aptly described there, no adult kids are not launching, so now they're staying, they're around, and there are things that are happening so that all of a sudden we don't have the resources and ability to do what we need to do. Next slide. And this comes down to the balance, right? And I think this is the hardest part.
Yep.
Right? So this becomes the hardest part of trying to figure out and decide what makes sense. I mean, the statistics show that it's not just, like we talked about, a money thing.
Right.
but it's a time thing, and this time part of it takes away from other aspects of our life, including work, including to be able to earn.
Oh, absolutely. The cost either way, which again, is it financial or is it time? And our time actually is money, especially when, a lot of families, it's a dual income.
Right.
Right? So if someone is giving up time to support, and the other thing that's kind of different now too is, if you go back a generation or so, families used to be a little bit larger. So you could share the care situation among different siblings. Now it seems to be that, one sibling is getting most of the burden.
Right.
Right, and typically it's a female sibling.
That is the case usually, but that's what we're running into, is that the burden, however you want to describe that, falls onto one family member or one family unit that ends up having to deal with that. But the statistics show that the cost, time away from work, right, ends up costing, it's like tens of thousands of dollars about, going, forget about the money aspect, forget about the cost of whether it's care or doing this, but just the whole idea of having to move from one to another, shuffling around, taking them doctor's appointments, visits, that type of thing. Care needs, which is something that everybody has to deal with. And so it comes down to every family is, how do we deal with that? How do we do the trade-off? How do we make that happen in such a way where the unit is still the unit, but it's not taking away from, to say it feels like a burden on somebody it's a hard thing to describe when we're talking about a family.
Well, I think that's part of the issue, right? There's a lot of, not to say in a bad way, but guilt associated with the fact that, do I feel burdened? I shouldn't feel burdened. They took care of me. I'm taking care of them.
Right.
Right? But it is. It's because you're not just taking care of yourself a lot of the time. You do have other family members.
Yeah.
And like I said, if you were working and, things get disturbed that way. So it's not necessarily saying, you should feel guilty, but that's just not alone if you do. A lot of people feel that way. It's a burnout situation. How much can you stretch yourself and provide those services? Now, the really difficult part is knowing when to cut that off.
Yeah.
Right? Knowing when you can provide the service and when you don't have the skill set to do that. And that becomes a comfort level. And the older sometimes your parents get, the less comfortable they're going to be with people coming in and helping.
Yes.
They want the family member there.
Right. Right. And we're doing a whole thing on the whole idea and concept of aging in place. But aging in place sometimes can be having to have that family member move in. Right, so it's no longer they're aging in place with you at the same time. Like, I still like that word, launch.
Launch,
like that the adult children haven't left the nest yet.
You can light a fire under them, right?
Yeah, got to do something. Maybe it's having them move in with Nana or Grandpa, and then that'll
the people
do
you're
it.
taking care of, let them take care of each other, right?
Next slide, please. Okay. So one of the things that comes up with this, besides like we talked about with the whole idea of time and money, it becomes a health concern, right? And this is something that we talk about a lot, especially when we talk about older individuals, assisted care, or in the special needs world, having to deal with someone who's differently abled. As a caregiver, a lot of times, as Craig just mentioned, we tend to be focused on the care and the care need and the caregiving aspect of this, and really start to neglect or forget we got to take care of ourselves.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, think about it, the average life expectancy for a woman is 87, right? So as we've talked about several times, average only means that some people die sooner, some people die later.
Right.
So let's say you've got a 92-year-old mother you're caring for, you're 66, 67 years old yourself.
Yeah.
Right? And now you're trying to lift them up, help them shower, do all the physical things. You end up hurting yourself.
Right.
Right? Or burning yourself out, or because you're not 25 years old anymore, right? So it's the physical, sometimes it's the caregivers that get sicker than the people needing the care just because they are getting burnt out at both ends.
Right. Right. And that's one of the things to be thinking about with this, is to be aware that if you are trying to do this, that a lot of times that caregiver has to take a step back. There has to be respite. There has to be something that says, wait a minute, I'm burning myself out here. I can't, I want to take care of mom, but I can't continue to do it.
Right.
Forget about that. I'm taking away from other parts and aspects of my world and my life. I just physically can't continue to do it because I'm going to just end up burning out in terms of the whole thing. Next slide. So this is more of a fun term with it. It's the rise of the double-decker, or what we would call the triple-decker sandwich, right? The triple-decker family. As Craig just described, almost pinpoint on this. Now think of this is the family, the dynamic of the individual who is now 60 years old, caring for mom or dad who's in their late 80s.
Yep.
I've got an adult child and a grandchild, right? We're building many, many deckers here in terms of the family dynamic.
We're really all the Waltons now.
I don't know if there were more Waltons,
Stuff
but I'm
them
sure
all in
somewhere
one
up.
house. Well,
I'm sure up on that
later
mountain
episodes, yes.
there were more people up on that mountain. But the concept here is this dynamic can happen. This does happen, and a lot of times, anything that goes on in our worlds, anything that goes on in our life, it just happens. Like, it's not something we planned for, it's not something we thought about. All of a sudden we're doing it, and what you wind up, like in my world, I've got family members, my older siblings, their grandparents, watching the grandkids, right?
Yep.
So you have that, like, oh, that's just a fun thing, but then it becomes like this is a need. They have to do this.
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm kind of going down a little different road than I expected, but yes, it's the caregiver issue. How can you both be working dual income, because of almost needed these days, especially in this area, right? In order just to make things work. And then how do you go back to work and have children and pay for care?
Yeah.
It's almost, is it worth going to work after you get done paying for care? So now you have the grandparents stepping into that role that maybe they weren't expecting to step into.
Yes.
When they planned their family out 20, 30 years ago. And so the dynamics are changing once again, which once again, as that shift happens later, even more guilt on you because they watch your kids. How can you not take care of them?
Yeah.
Right.
Next slide. So what can you do? Well, we always talk about setting goals, no matter what it is we're trying to accomplish. Whether we're trying to accomplish something that's financial, something that's professional, something that's personal, we're always talking about setting goals. But I think in this case, what we're really talking about here is goal setting when it comes to the family dynamic. Specifically, maybe it's setting up and having the conversation with those adult children about, like Craig said, I don't want to say lighting the fire, but launching them some point, or getting them to the point of hey, this is what needs to happen, or hey, you've got to contribute, you've got to be part. If you're part of the household, you've got to be part of the household. Budgeting and setting it that way with adult parents, whether it's grandparents or parents, about the care and what can be done, how it can be done, what's offered. Maybe it's looking at the idea of, from that respite standpoint, bringing somebody in who can help support and allow some of it to continue with what needs to be done.
Yep.
These are all things that you can do, all things that you can start to think about. But I think a lot of that comes down to having to break it down and think, what's going on in my world? And how can I deal with that?
Well, I think the other thing too here that's really important, and I think it's always important in making any financial decisions, is communication, right? What are your parents expecting of you should they age and have issues? What are you expecting that you can provide or are willing to provide? If you're married,
right,
and there's a spouse involved, what is their role in this whole thing, both financially and physically? If you have siblings, how are they contributing? Is they contributing physically or financially? Is there a plan in place, for care, long-term care situation, those types of things? Should something happen that you can't handle? Assets, where they have a house, are you caring for their house along with them? So it's really just important to have communication, both the other way too. If your grandparents are taking care of their grandchildren, is there certain days they're doing it, certain days they're not? Are they picking them up? Are they dropping them off? How is all that being handled? So once again, the more you can communicate, the more people just don't expect that X, Y, Z is going to happen. You've had that conversation.
Right, and I think we run into that, we see that a lot. We see that a lot with the family dynamic, and especially when we're talking about care.
Right.
that a lot of times it's almost this, let's call it an expectation.
Right.
Right. This expectation that, well, I did it for Nana, you're going to do it for me type of thing.
Right, I'm just going to move in with you. Right.
Exactly. And we get it a lot. That happens a lot with conversations where it's like, well, okay, my kids, I did it for my mom, my kids are going to do it for me, and not to cut to the chase with it, but with a lot of people, it's, have you had that conversation with your children? And a lot of times that communication has not been done or expressed in such a way.
Well, the other issue too is people aren't living all in one town anymore.
Yes.
You may have, your kids may live across the country.
Right.
And so now how do you handle logistics is another factor. So there's things you don't want to wait
Yeah.
on. You want to be having these conversations. A lot of us have them in jest, like you're at turkey, dinner and going, Mom gets old, she's going to move in with you.
Right,
No,
right.
she's not. She's moving in with you.
Yeah,
Blah, 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 blah. Right. But I think at some point you want to have that conversation before, get the insurance before you crash the car.
Yeah.
Don't wait till something happens and then go, okay, now we got to figure this out.
Next slide. So there are ways that your employer, if you're in a situation as a caregiver, right, that there are situations, you've got the Family Medical Leave Act, you can explain to your current employer, depending on how long you've been with your employer, depending on standing, and let them know this is what's happening. Certainly in today's world, and coming out of COVID, having a remote or being able to work remotely has freed up a little bit of that.
Sure.
That, hey, I'm watching, staying with my mom 1 or 2 days a week. Can I be remote for those days just so that there's somebody in the house? That type of thing. But there's also the Family Medical Leave Act that you can use, and your employer has other options and ways that they can support that.
Absolutely. Yep.
Next slide. Again, we go back to this because it is something that Craig and I have both seen on a regular and frequent basis, as Craig mentioned, where the caregiver ends up being the one who ends up getting more sick or in worse shape. And a lot of that is just the respite, just the idea of taking a break, finding somebody who can help. Whether if siblings are in other parts of the country, maybe they can support it in a different way. Like I said, that's bringing somebody in who can then be there or help with whatever needs to be done for those time periods that you are unable to or need that break.
Yeah, because a lot of times, a person doesn't come with an expiration date. So you start doing this care. Am I doing this for a year, 5 years, 10 years? And without knowing, what the expectation is, it's very difficult, I think, sometimes mentally to keep it together.
Yes.
Right? Because, sometimes you have an expectation you have kids. Well, when they go to college, I'll get a little bit of a break. A little tiny bit.
Little tiny bit.
But like I said, when you're caring for an elderly parent, they could be around 20 years. You have no idea. And so that's why I think it's really important to know what the expectations are. I keep saying that, but I think you can't make that.
Right, and that is part of it, because that's part of the whole thing with the caring for the caregiver that you really need to be, because this happens a lot with caregivers, is they get isolated. They get really, as Craig said, that some of that becomes this, it's an overwhelming task. Like, I didn't realize I was going to be in this thing for 5 years or 7 years when I started this. I was just trying to help out, and they get a lot of that depression that goes along with it.
Yeah. The other thing too, a lot of times you get a little, I don't want to have anybody else coming in to take care of mom or dad, right? But you also don't want to, and unfortunately this is a side effect, sometimes resentment can build up because you are missing out on some of the things you were thinking you were going to do, and then you're tired and have to go back and do things you didn't want to do, and it's not meant to be towards that parent or sibling or whoever you're caring for, but it's just a natural consequence of being overwhelmed.
Right. Next slide. All right, so understand that, situations come up. This happens frequently, it happens on a regular basis. Whatever the situation that you might be finding yourself in or getting yourself to, just know it's probably happened before.
Oh yeah, you're not the first one to go through
You're not the first one to get to go. What is that saying? The rodeo? Like, this is not you're not the first.
It's not my first rodeo.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Something like that. I knew, right? So just understand that there's places you can go. There's resources that you can find because somebody else has been in that same situation. The other one there, the second line says, don't try to go it alone. That's like, I think the probably about the best advice that you can have with that is like, don't try to take it all on yourself. I know that sometimes we say like if I'm the only child and it's my mom, I want to deal with it all. But as we said, and we've stressed it a couple of times in this, the caregiver ends up getting in worse situation than the person who needing the care.
Right, and sometimes not going alone is as easy as I just need a buddy to vent to.
Right.
Right? Not necessarily someone to take over the care. And it may be, I need someone to take over care for a short time. I need to take a break,
That's
a
the
vacation.
time for yourself. Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And that whole idea that the respite and having a break or time or even if it's honestly, as we talked about, where this is time away from work, maybe just time back to work, doing something along those lines that you're like, okay, I can get myself back to work.
Yeah, not to sound cliche, but you can't pour from an empty cup, right?
Yes. As we know, because
yes.
as we get to the end of these, right? It's
more
there.
touche than cliche, right?
And then the last one on there, I think it's really for anybody as you're dealing with all of this stuff. That goals are important, right? It's the idea to have the goal, whatever the goal may be. Again, whether we're talking financial, personal, professional, whatever it is, but you need a plan. Because see, a goal without a plan is just a wish. Mm-hmm. And a wish for situations like this is when we get ourselves into problems. That's when trouble happens. That's when all the chaos occurs. And then like Craig said, next thing you know, we're in scramble mode because the disaster has happened.
Yeah, you can't overestimate, the weight of doing a little bit of planning ahead on these things. How much it can make things easier later on.
Right.
And this is every situation we get into financial strategy, whether it's retirement, whether it's taking care of family, whether it's putting in emergency reserves. A little bit of planning goes a long, long way.
Absolutely. And next slide. And on that note, that's why we're here, right? So for us, the concept is always, you never know what the situation is, and sometimes it helps just to have that conversation. Just to say, this is what I've been thinking about, or this is what's been kicking around, or this is what's been bothering me. Mm-hmm. For those watching us on TV, you can just pause the show right now, that QR code that pops up on the screen. Just take your phone out, shoot the QR code. It's going to open up our calendar. Schedule a time. There's no cost. It's complimentary. We're here to answer questions. That's the whole idea behind the foundation, behind Aries and what we do. But honestly, as Craig said, like a plan is so important, and sometimes that plan got put in place years ago, prior to the pandemic type of thing.
Oh yeah, the old plan might not be the plan that's going to work, so you need to revamp your plan on occasion. Yeah, yeah. And just so you know, I've looked at all the channels out there. We are the most interesting thing to watch on TV. So there's nothing else out there.
What is that? There's 300 channels and there's nothing on, or whatever the Bruce Springsteen song was. Next one. All right, so if you ever have any questions, you can always reach out to us. The website, again, that's ariesfoundation.org/contact. We'll take you right to the contact page. Mm-hmm. You can just fill it out, send it in, somebody will reach out to you. Again, the scheduling, that back up and just use the QR code, it's probably easier. Email is info@ariesfoundation.org. But also, we've got social media channels out there. We're on Facebook, we're on Instagram, we're on LinkedIn. Whatever you're supposed to do on those, like us, follow us, whatever it is that you're supposed to do, check us out. We've got a YouTube channel. Check that out as well. You can see us on New TV, on their YouTube channel, or also live on, well, it's not live, but whatever it is.
Or your kids can help you figure it out, just like mine do.
Some way, somehow, to make that happen in terms of going through it. But reach out to us. That's why we're here. We're here to answer questions. That's what this is about. Next slide. And that was it for everybody. See, I knew I got to the end somewhere. Go back one. Bring us back to that so that we're there in terms of going through it. So, listen, we just want to say, if you run into any of these situations, we know family dynamics can be tough. So we just want to say, just take the time, take a step back, take a breath, understand that there are resources, places you can go, things you can do that make it a little bit easier and a little bit more conducive in terms of trying to help everybody. Yep. And on that note, we want to say thanks and skål.
Skål.
start filming the next one, then we can just have her, Vicky, be the last one.
Yeah, so that's-